Thanks. Hi, I'm Kate Casey from Stanford Graduate School of Business. And this project is from Temena's social contract. This is really looking at the question of how can we make democracy more effective? So how can we make democracy work better to constrain the behavior of elected officials? So this is in Sierra Leone, where we face a bit of an accountability puzzle. So Sierra Leone, like many sub-Saharan African countries, transitioned to multi-party democracy relatively recently. And of course, a key motivation for this is if you give citizens direct voice, it creates stronger incentives for politicians to behave better and give citizens a direct mechanism to discipline and punish bad performers. So you vote out the bad and vote in the good. The puzzle comes in is that if you look at voting in Sierra Leone, it doesn't actually seem to be very responsive to performance. So you see the same parties, the same individuals getting elected and re-elected with very healthy vote margins in the face of persistently bad public service delivery, persistently low government performance pretty much across the board. And I just want to be clear, these are free and fair elections. They get a lot of international support. So this is not about voter fraud or voter intimidation. People are casting ballots that are counted. So the question is, where is this accountability mechanism breaking down? And why isn't democracy working better to really get high performance out of government officials? And so there's obviously a lot of factors that feed into this. The one that my research has been focused on is what is the role of information? And I mean, the premise is pretty simple. So you can't have electoral accountability if voters have no information about government, about the performance of politicians. And so why might this be so? So in a country like Sierra Leone, the reach of mass media is very limited, and it's limited by poverty. So fewer than 10% of households own a television. So if you think about televised news, it's just not relevant. Fully 70% of adults have 0 years of formal schooling, so they're illiterate, they're not going to be reading print media. You can forget about the internet. I hate to say that in Silicon Valley, but it's just not relevant, at least not yet. So what is relevant? So the radio is a great source of information. I did some research earlier that looked at the role of information in building people's political knowledge and changing the way they vote. So in general, politics in Sierra Leone is organized around ethnicity. So there's 2 big ethnic groups and 2 big political parties, and these allegiances are very strong and date back to the period around independence. So I found that people who had access to the radio learned a lot about politicians and were more willing to vote across these sort of ethnic lines for good quality politicians. But even there, only about half of households own a radio. So then, as you would expect, when you come to election day, voters don't have very much information or knowledge about the people they're voting between. And so this project, and this is with Kelly Bidwell and Rachel Glenister, is going to focus on the 2012 parliamentary elections in Sierra Leone. So you can think about parliament there as akin to the US House of Representatives here. So these are small geographic areas that send one person to represent them in the capital. And so we surveyed people basically immediately after they'd voted, and we said, what are the MPs meant to be doing in office? And fully 64% of people could not name a single job responsibility, legislating, writing laws, representing our interests in the national government. So they didn't have an idea of what they were meant to do, and they had really no information about how much money these politicians controlled. And so this, for purposes of today, I'm going to focus on the Constituency Facilitation Fund because it is by far the largest pot of public money that is controlled by these MPs directly. So they have full discretionary authority at an individual level about how to spend this money, which is meant to provide public goods in constituencies. So we asked voters, this CFF, it's pretty well established. It's been going on for years. People know about it. So we said, how much money does your politician get every year? And even in a really generous ballpark, only 3% of people had any idea how much money was at stake. So, I mean, now my accountability puzzle doesn't seem like much of a puzzle because if voters don't know who their MP is, don't know what they're meant to be doing in office, and don't know how much money they control, it's really hard to imagine that their votes are going to create these strong incentives for good performance. So, I mean, this just kind of immediately confronts us with 2 fundamental questions. So the first is how can you create a new source of political information in this context? So this source of information, it needs to be credible, it needs to be engaging, and it needs to be accessible to voters who are very poor, illiterate, and living in geographically remote areas. The second question is, even if you've made progress on the first and you have an exciting new source of information, how do you know whether it works? How do you know whether it's effective in changing voter behavior and in changing voter behavior in a way that triggers a response by politicians and makes politicians behave better? So I'm going to start with the first question. So in terms of this new source of information, we got really excited about this idea of political debates. So these are debates between candidates from rival parties before the election. And what I like about debates is they're just an incredibly rich source of information. So you get all the hard facts, you know, what are their professional qualifications? What are their policy stances? What do they plan to do in office? But then you get all this like very nuanced information about, you know, how charismatic are they? How articulate are they? Are they persuasive? Do they seem trustworthy? And this all comes across, you know, pretty immediately. So to do this, we worked with a local partner, Search for Common Ground. They're civil society, nonpartisan, very well respected in Sierra Leone, to host these debates, to assemble candidates and host the debates. So this is a still from one of the debates, just to give you a sense of what this looks like. So the gentleman on the far side in green, he's the SLPP, that's the main opposition party. The green is their party symbol, it's the palm tree. The candidate in red is from the All People's Congress, that's the incumbent party. Again, rising sun is their symbol, hence the red cowboy outfit. And then the moderator is in glasses, so he's a very well-known radio personality in Freetown, the capital. And then the gentleman on the end in orange is a third party. And the third party is basically a splinter off that first green party. And just like as a sidebar, one of the things I love, so if you look at this picture, to me, and I don't know about you, but it seems obvious that the guy in orange is like not going to win. Like, I mean, if he gets any votes, like if his mother votes for him, it'll be a miracle if those are the other two choices. But what did the debates look like? So they were very structured. So there were a series of national policy questions. Each candidate was given equal time to respond. They were very civil. They touched on things like healthcare reform. Should we massively reform our healthcare system or not? They talked about women's empowerment. So there was a legislation for a 30% quota for women in government. So would you vote for that? Would you not? Why? And then things like, you know, what is your key priority for development? Like, are you the education guy? Are you the health guy? And then how are you going to get that done? What's your plan? How are you going to make progress? So that gives you a sense. So there's a whole bunch of these debates that our partner hosted and they videotaped. And so now the question is, how are we going to get this kind of innovative source of information to the voters? And so here what the partner did is they had a roadshow, a mobile cinema, which literally means they had a truck. They put the generator into the truck, you put the sound system in the truck, the projector in the truck, and then you drive it around to communities in the weeks leading up to the election. And when they got to the communities, they'd wait till the sun sets, and then they'd project the video physically onto the side of the polling center itself. So in your mind, think of like a primary school or a community center. And it's a big party, you know, it's fun. They play music, everybody assembles. On average, about 200 people would show up. You know, you talk to your neighbors, and they would watch these debates. So we thought this was brilliant. This was such an innovative use. I mean, this is like low-tech tech, but it was super cool, and it was like a very large advance on the status quo of what was going on. But of course, we were not the only people that thought we had great ideas in how to improve governance. So then this comes to the second question of how do we know whether this works? How do we know if this is actually going to change behavior? And here I want to like just jump really deep into the weeds on the experimental design because it's important, but just keep in mind it's complicated because we're trying to ask two related questions. So one, how do debates impact voters? And two, how do debates impact politicians? So we're going to randomize on two levels. So this gives you a bird's eye view of our experiment overall. But let's start at the highest level of aggregation. So here we randomized across geographic constituencies, right? So these are like the congressional districts. So there's over 100 of these in Sierra Leone. We narrowed it down to about 28 that we thought would be pretty competitive. And then we just had a lottery. So 14, the candidates, got together, had the debate, then we had the roadshow, and the other 14, it's just completely politics as usual. And then importantly, the second level of randomization is inside each of these treated or the debate constituencies. This is where we had the roadshow, and this is where we're going to get impacts on voters. So the truck went around to polling centers, and we randomly allocated which polling centers would be on its route. So we had over 200 polling centers that we tracked over this period, half of which were visited buy the truck and half of which were not. So then we're going to track forward to election day, and we're going to survey voters, some of whom have seen the video and some of whom haven't. And so this, on election day, we surveyed over 5,000 people, and we asked them about their political knowledge and how they voted. And so this is that first question: do debates impact voter behavior? And we find absolutely that they do. So first, really large gains in political knowledge. So if you come back to that constituency facilitation fund, I said only 3% of people had any idea how much money was in this. If you look in the debate communities, that increases by more than 5-fold. So now on election day, nearly 20% of people know how much money that MP has to spend each year in office. They learn things about the qualifications of candidates. So for example, the proportion of people who could tell you which candidate was better educated increased from about 1/4 to 40%. And they learned where they stood on these important policy issues, healthcare, women's empowerment, which sector they want to prioritize. And importantly, the key voter outcome here is, did this knowledge change how they cast their votes? And so across all of these areas, on average, we find about a 5 percentage point increase in vote shares for the candidates who perform best during the debates. And I know you're immediately going to say, well, how do you judge who performed best? And it's tricky, but we did it in 2 ways. One, we just asked voters, which candidate do you think performed best during the debate? But you might think that's a little subjective. So we also assembled a panel of experts, government officials, civil society, and we had them watch all these videos and score each candidate's response to each question, and you average across multiple experts. What's interesting is the voters and the experts agreed in most, actually the great majority of these cases of who performed better. So this, I think the takeaway from this is voters respond to information, and they respond to information even by changing who they vote for. So they are willing to move towards better candidates if you give them enough information. So now, but this is not enough to close that electoral accountability loop, right? Because what we now care about, is it a big enough information shock that the politicians are going to respond with better behavior? So the first suggestion or the hint that this might be going on happened a little bit earlier in time during the campaign period. So if you come back to the campaign period, remember this truck is going around to villages, and we didn't tell the candidates where the truck was going, but it's rural Sierra Leone, so you can figure out when there's been a big assembly of 200 people after the fact. And so what we did, we collected a lot of data on how the candidates allocated their time, and we find that candidates made more in-person visits, and they made higher campaign expenditures in these communities that were becoming much more politically informed, which is consistent with the idea that this is making these elections more competitive. It's mixing up who people are voting for, like a swing voter theory. Now it's a little bit up in the air which party is going to win, and the candidates double down with greater effort. But really the most important thing is tracing the winners over time. And to say, so this is the question, so if I inform all these voters, they now know who these candidates are, what they're meant to do, how much money they have, and the winners know that the voters know this. Does that close the accountability loop? So to answer this, come back and remember, at the highest level, we randomized, across constituencies. So after election day, we have 28 winners, 14 of whom by lottery participated in this whole debates, hosting and roadshow, and 14 politics as usual. So we followed those 28 MPs over their first year and a half in office and collected a lot of data on performance. And so here we find some evidence that indeed it did close the accountability loop. So I've picked 2 indicators here. One is pretty immediate. They made more visits home. So they made more visits back to their constituency and meeting with their constituents, public meetings, getting a pulse of what's going on the ground and reporting back on what they were doing. But the money shot is that we looked at this CFF, and we had the MPs itemize everything that they had spent this discretionary money on. And then we did these very intensive field audits to try to verify those expenditures. So if they said, I repaired the roof of a school, we went to the school and we spoke to the principal and we said, what's the status of the roof? Was it repaired? Do you have paper documents? Who paid for it? Et cetera, et cetera. So the politics as usual MPs, we could only verify about 1/3 of this money have actually being spent on development projects in the constituency. If you then look at the debate MP, that amount increases by 2.5 times, right? So we could verify nearly 90% of these funds of having gone to development projects. So just to wrap up, the government of Sierra Leone was excited to see these results. They're keen, the National Electoral Commission is keen to scale this up. So what we're talking to them about now is how can we spread these debates to more constituencies and reach more voters at lower cost, because that truck was innovative but is very expensive. So we're talking about radio. And then the related research question is, if we announce this in advance, that there's going to be this free platform for mass communication with voters, does that change who decides to run for office, right? Some people that maybe aren't in with the political elites, but maybe think if I have a direct voice to the people, I might get elected. So thank you very much.